All right. Hey, welcome, guys. I'm glad you guys are joining us for the next hour. We want to have this great conversation, and I want to learn with you guys from our amazing panelists, and I'm so glad that you guys are joining us. Well, our goal for the next hour is to talk about the movie Just Mercy. And our goal is not to critique the movie. We're not film critics here, but the goal is to talk about the themes, especially as it deals with race, especially as we've been experiencing the racial tensions in America the last month or so. With that, the way this is going to work is that the first half of this is going to be an interview and just a conversation with our panelists. And during that time, if you guys have questions, just put it down into the YouTube comments or text us at this number, 562-246-8147. And text us those questions, and we want to answer those questions on the second part of this conversation, and we're going to have our panelists answer them. All right. Well, I'm going to have our panelists introduce themselves, and then we're going to jump right in. So first, Dr. Collier.
Hi, I am Dr. Deshonna Collier-Goubil. I go by Dr. Collier, and I am an associate professor and chair of the Department of Criminal Justice at Azusa Pacific University.
That's okay.
I study race in the criminal justice system and gender in the criminal justice system. Happy to be here.
I'm Adam Edgerly, and I'm the pastor of New Song Los Angeles Covenant Church, and also a consultant with a group called Culture Consultants, and I serve on the board of trustees here at Biola.
I'm Whitney Barnard, and I'm a film student alumni here at Biola, and I'm currently working on a documentary about Ferguson.
Hello, I'm Dr. Leon Harris. I'm an assistant professor here at Talbot School of Theology, and my specialty is undergrad theology, and I'm happy to be here, and I'm the husband of Joyce Harris. Hi, Joyce.
Thank you for introducing yourselves. Well, as we start, what I'd love to hear is, we're going to hear a lot of your thoughts and ideas about the movie, but what I love to hear is what you were feeling as you were watching this movie, and some of the thoughts and some of the emotions that were brought up, and maybe even a poignant scene that stuck out to you.
All right, I think I'll jump out there and start. So it's an area that I research. So I actually do enjoy when areas that I research are turned into movies, because sometimes it's easier to communicate things to people that way rather than perhaps a journal article, for example. So I thought the story was intriguing. It pulls you in, it captivates you, you're able to follow it well. So I really love that. I think a scene that really stuck out to me the most is when the main character goes in to visit his clients the first time, and he is treated like an inmate, and he's made to disrobe all the way down.
Yeah.
And it was, not a rule, not something that generally happens to attorneys when they're going in to visit clients. And so it was strictly for the purposes of degrading and dehumanizing him. So I think that's something that just kind of stuck with me.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Anybody else?
Okay, I guess I'll jump in. I think for me, the experience I had, like we were discussing earlier, I saw the movie in my neighborhood, and it was about a 97% black audience, and it was pretty full. It was on a Friday, and I remember it was packed, and the people, the ages, it ranged from like 10 up to over 80 or 90. And the reason why I know it was over 80 or 90, because I heard a couple of ladies go, my birthday was yesterday, and I'm 90 years old. So I kind of know they were 90. But it was interesting because the entire movie, it was this ebb and flow of emotions. It was as if all of us now, this was our story. We all could identify. If it wasn't us directly, we had a family member who went through something similar. So you can tell at various points, people would yell out, or you can see them just bawl and cringe at what was happening. But it was a good moment. But for me, one of the moments that the scenes that really stood out was when Johnny D's character, when the judge told him, sorry, it's denied.
Right.
And when Brian's character Brian Stephen was ready to give up, but I just saw that shift in hope. Because to me, Johnny D, his dignity was restored. The truth was out there. So he's now all of a sudden he goes, you know what? I'm a human again. My dignity is restored. I'm a human being. And I saw his humanness restored. And after that humanness was restored, he was able to now feed back hope into Brian Stevenson's character and go, don't give up. Don't stop. So that was a real poignant moment for me. And it also spoke to relationship. They had developed such a close relationship that now it was feeding on each other, and it became a reciprocity of give and take, which to me is so crucial to a theological project of relationship, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Wow, I'll jump in. I thought about the scene when Brian Stevenson visits Johnny D's family and all of the neighbors, and it reminded me that when we talk about one person's life, the ripple effects are huge, and all of these other people are impacted, and children are impacted, and spouses, and neighbors, and so each story, each individual that is mistreated under our justice system, they're not just one person, they're whole communities of people.
I think for me, my experience watching the film, I was in a mostly empty theater, and so it really felt like I was just sucked into the story, and that like I myself was a part of it. And kind of what you were saying, Dr. Harris, about we see this story reflected in all of our communities on different levels and in different situations. But for me, one of the scenes that really stuck with me was the scene of Herb's execution, and I think that was just a scene where it showed how much, like, when one person is hurt and when one person isn't receiving justice, like, we're all not receiving justice. And so, that was one scene that I couldn't stop thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, goosebumps still, just thinking about all the clinking and stuff like that. Well, I mean, this movie was set about 35 years ago in Alabama, and I think there's this temptation to think that there's been progress in America in race and in the legal system since then. What are some of the issues that are presented in this movie that we still have to look at today, and we still have to investigate and just take a closer look at even today?
I think I'll jump out there again.
Please, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's so important. Like, I think the film is so important. Right now, I think the spotlight is on law enforcement and policing. And right now, today in our society, especially with the homicides of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd most recently. But the judicial system is where it really makes a difference. And so I think the film is able to highlight that. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't focus on law enforcement, because that's definitely very important right now. But it gives us this opportunity to see that it really is, there's some problematic themes throughout the criminal justice system. It's not just with policing. So I feel like that's what this movie helps us to kind of bring out and dig into.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Well, I for me, part of it too is, I think one of the themes that we're dealing with still today is within the church. We have, for me, looking at it from, I was going to say Christological, but I was told not to use fancy terms. So, you guys knew who I am when you called me. So looking at it through a lens of Jesus Christ. Looking at the lens of Jesus Christ, fulfilling a messianic prophecy, the prophetic work of Christ. And in the Old Testament, it was about Jesus bringing justice to the world, bringing justice to those who don't have justice and those who don't have oppressions. And it's interesting because one of the first things that Jesus did after the temptations, we went to the temple and opened up the scroll, and the first thing he said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." Why? Because I'm about to relieve good news to the poor. I'm going to deliver the oppressed. I'm going to give sight to the blind, and I'm going to relieve the captives from prison. That's how you know the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and which is what he did. And then he authorized the church, in my mind, to do the same thing. So the church now, unfortunately, in the history, past history, it was the church who was either complicit or explicit in the injustice. And right now, we're still struggling with that to this day. And so I think that's one thing I think the film really brought out well, is the church is still struggling, because if you notice, a lot of the characters in prison, they went to either scripture or some spiritual song or something for a place of comfort. But everyone else, it wasn't part of their reality. So I think that is still something we're struggling with from a theological standpoint.
Yeah, thank you.
I think about how we are accustomed to watching courtroom dramas, and I think part of the brilliance of Brian Stevenson in telling his story is that he wove this one courtroom drama through the tale of all of these different cases he had worked on, and that's engaging, but our tendency is to think of it as an individual story. And so even with the case of George Floyd, I think one of the things we are still struggling with is like you were saying, looking at the systemic issue here. How do you get an officer with 18 complaints against him, still on the force, still training other officers, and able to finally kill somebody on camera?
Wow.
And then my daughter, she's a teenager, and she's looking at this as like, why is it taking so long to arrest this guy? And we do a little digging, and we find out about this thing called qualified immunity, where police officers are not treated the same under the law as a normal citizen would be treated. And then district attorneys know that, prosecutors know that. And so if the Supreme Court is going to give really broad license to police officers under qualified immunity, then charges won't be brought because everybody knows we're going to lose that case. So it's one of those systemic things that we have a danger of missing that if we just focus on the individual story. And as evangelicals, we're much more prone to focus on the individual story than even a normal American would be.
Yeah, thank you.
I think for me, one thing that I feel like we're still dealing with is the idea of like who deserves compassion, and a second look at like their story and what happened, because obviously with Johnny D's case, it was very clear, like, he was innocent, but a lot of people, there's a presumption of guilt if you look a certain way, or if you're from a certain community, that we still deal with today. So I think that's one thing that we're definitely still dealing with.
Yeah, well, if I could start with you for this next question, Ms. Barnard. We're gonna, a lot of Hollywood films, when it deals with injustice, kind of end on this happy note, just because it sells. That's just what Hollywood does. If the audience were to walk out of this film just thinking, everything will just resolve itself, what are the dangers in that?
I think one of the biggest dangers that I see in that is the tendency to burn out. Because I think a lot of people are definitely getting involved in the conversation and want to be a part of change right now, who haven't maybe taken those steps prior, and so they don't really know just how long this case took. And when I was looking at an interview with the director of the film, he was saying, when you write a historical film, you have to take certain liberties. And he was saying, I had to collapse the timeline, because obviously we're not going to sit and watch 2 years on screen. And so he was saying, I had to collapse the timeline. And I think if the director is saying, hey, this stuff actually takes a long time, the story was not wrapped up very quickly, then we should also take that as a cue to be like, okay, whatever work we want to do is also going to take time, and it's not going to be finished in 2.5 hours or so.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I'm sorry.
No, please.
No, I already talked too much. No, for me, I think I'd like to add to what Whitney said as well. I think part of the thing we should walk away from this also is it was people who also caused the change. It just didn't happen by itself. Yeah. And I think that's quite biblical. Israel prayed for deliverance, God sent Moses. Israel prayed for deliverance, God sent judges. Israel prayed for deliverance, somebody else came. The world prayed for deliverance, God sent Jesus. Then Jesus turned around and authorized the apostles and sent them out. And I think it was Paul who said he prayed for help. I can't remember it exactly, but he prayed for help, and God sent Timothy. So we are the change. We are the one. So I think one thing to leave is not that everything will be okay. I'm empowered now to change things. And that recognition that we are God's ambassadors, and it's up to us to change it. And we have to actively seek out justice. We have to actively actively overturn these injustice systems in the world. And that's part of our job. We are the answer to the prayer. Sometimes I'm done.
I was just going to add that I think that there's this danger of this redemptive nature. So because it wrapped up so pretty with a nice little bow on the end, that it redeems all of the other characters and all of the other sins or the issues within the structure of the system is okay because, like, you know, in the end, it's going to be okay. But for every Johnny D, how many hundreds of people did we put to death who were innocent, right? So starting from there and then working our way backwards to looking at, so how did we get here? So how did we get to a Johnny D? So what happened in the court system with the prosecutors and their external investigator? Because prosecutors don't always just go with what law enforcement does, right? Sometimes they have external investigators. So what happened in that? How come you didn't interview all these other people that this one attorney with like a volunteer worker was able to uncover, right? And then backing it up to the law enforcement officers who seemed to, there was kind of some hints at there being this ulterior motive as to why Johnny D was kind of pegged for this. So ending it with that bow on the end, it eliminates all these places that we need to fix in the system. And so I think that that's the danger. I think, you know, it's been a very involved month for my field, I'll say. And I'm often asked, like, so what do you do on social media to help you kind of deal with the stress? And like, do you post feel good stories on your social media? And I'm like, no, I don't do that because I don't feel good. So I'm not going to post feel-good stories to make other people feel good when I don't feel good. This doesn't feel good. Welcome to my pain. And let's sit in it for a minute because maybe then we'll do something about it.
Wow. Well, you know, the film does touch on how the politics of fear and anger just reinforce this injustice in the justice system. You know, if Dr. Collier, you could unpack, you know, what are the places that this system might be unjust, and how do we care for our brothers and sisters who are being unjustly prosecuted?
It's a good question. Thank you. It's a very involved question. So I think that, we need to turn it over on every area, right? So injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, is a Dr. King quote that I live by. So I think wherever we see it, wherever we find it, we need to uncover it and we need to right the wrong. Is that not the call of the Christian? So I think thinking about how can we care for our folks that have been wronged, I mean, I think there's several things we can do. You know, one, we can hear them, and we can actually respect their lived experience. So I think that that's definitely a great starting place. So rather than having this knee-jerk reaction to try to refute it, you know, to try to say, well, my uncle is a cop, and so I think that he's a good uncle, so he must also be a great cop. These things are not the same. Okay, so, you know, my dad's a great dad, you know, not super awesome at cooking. It's not his thing, right? So, I mean, just because you're good at one thing doesn't mean that you're good at all things, I think is something. And so when someone is being vulnerable enough, because it's a deep place of vulnerability for somebody to share with you injustice that they have experienced, because generally we try to overcome, we try to move forward, we try to get out there, press on. So I think believing their lived experience would be the starting place, right? But I kind of want to turn the question on its head a little bit, because I think that for me, you know, I start out giving people respect, giving human lives dignity, and treating people as if they matter. So that part's not as hard or difficult for me. I think what's difficult is looking at the offenders, the true offenders in this, and how do we find a place to love them as Christ loved the church. I think that we often think that, like, oh yeah, just jump to like forgiveness. Forgiveness is slow for me. It's difficult. And I have to press forward to do that. When I think about those officers, I'm not there yet. I'm not there yet. I'm just going to be honest. So I think that that's what I would think about. So rather than placing those who have already been victimized by the system as being the ones that, like, you know, we need to figure out how to love them, I think that's just a given. It's like X is the given. That's given. You love them. They've already been through a lot.
Yeah.
So you love on them. You let them allow them to tell you how to treat them. The real offenders are the ones that's a little bit harder for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Collier, as you're talking about this, how we treat the offender, I'm thinking about Jesus' interaction with Pontius Pilate, where he says, you wouldn't have any authority over me unless it was given to you from above, and therefore the person who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. So there's the individual responsibility that Pilate is about to make the most catastrophic decision imaginable. But there's this system of complicity of all these other people involved who are bringing false charges, who are bringing him before this court in order to have him executed. And so Pilate is part of a machine, and Jesus identifies that. I think one of the challenges we have, particularly as evangelicals, from a theological point of view and historical point of view, is thinking in terms of systems. And you said something a moment ago about just recognizing that is that not our job as Christians to right wrongs? I don't believe that is a universally understood truth. I think it's a clear biblical truth. But it's a suppressed biblical truth within evangelicalism historically, and for good reason. As you trace the history in America, you find people were straining at gnats and swallowing camels when it came to slavery and Jim Crow and segregation and all of this. How do you reconcile those things within the human mind as you're reading the Bible that talks about a God of justice and a God who introduces himself to Moses as the one who hears the cries of the oppressed, and let's go do something about it, Moses. I mean, this is the God we serve, right? How do you reconcile those things? People did some amazing mental and emotional and spiritual gymnastics in the pulpit for centuries in America. So to state something that should be obvious, that it's our responsibility as Christians to step in when we see injustice and systems that are oppressive, I think we actually have to educate the evangelical community that that's a fact.
Yeah. That's so good.
Wow.
Yeah.
So good. Yeah.
Wow.
You know, this may sound, it's not going to be controversial, I don't think, and it's not a critique. It's just, let me just throw it out there to the panel. I'd like to just hear your ideal and your thinking. So this is again, not more of a, this is more of another discussion question. I'm taking over Mike's job.
You can do that, Dr. Harris, please.
So I see the title, Just Mercy, and I look at the word mercy, and for me, theologically, it's problematic for me, again, for me, because God's grace is just theologically, for me, described as God's freedom to love. Nothing outside of him coerces him to act. God freely loves, and that's just God's grace. Father, Son, and Spirit freely love each other. The Son loves the Father freely. The Son loves the Father back freely. The Holy Spirit participates in that love. So it's freedom to love, and that's just God's grace. God is a God of grace. When we experience that grace, then that's mercy, because we are experiencing something we don't really deserve. But in the movie, so I look at mercy from that lens, and I'm thinking, wait, just mercy? But he wasn't guilty of anything. He wasn't asking for, hey, have pity on me because I've committed a crime, except for being black. So for me, it really just justice is better. He really wanted justice. I wanted the same thing everyone else receiving. I'm owed that as an image bearer of God. But to me, mercy kind of has a connotation of, you did something, and you know what, we should go easy on you guys. Like, no, we didn't do anything. We owe the same rights as everyone else. That's all we're looking for. So again, that's just a crazy theological lens. I'm not critiquing the title. Title's a great title. Yeah. And I realize that. So yeah, trust me. But I'm thinking theologically, it can make it seem like Jamie Foxx, and the reason why I say that, because isn't that a natural tendency today? When some black person is shot by the police, you start trying to create a narrative well, he kind of deserved it. And you know what, the fact that we didn't shoot you, you're lucky, because you just really deserved it. And so that's,
Yeah, when he
that's
was 10 years old, he like cheated on the spelling bee. And so it doesn't matter. You know, he could be a person who just walked inside of a bank and robbed it, doesn't deserve to die on the street. You know, not in the country that believes in due process. So if you're supposed to, you are entitled to, it's a constitutional right in this country for you to get due process, for you to have a trial by a jury. It's not for you, all of that to be decided on a street corner.
Yeah.
It's just not the way our system is set up. So we're not even operating within the system that's set up. And then we have measures in place to protect people who are operating outside of that system. And so that is, getting back to what Pastor Edgerly said earlier, like that is the issue of, so looking at this systemically, not just individually. So like all of these individual stories, so getting into the individual narrative of like, well, but what did this person do? And well, they look like they may have done this or they may have done that. Like that's erasing the hundreds and thousands of persons who died on similar street corners. Just like that person. Whoever that person is today, right? So because it's been a different name every 3 months.
That's so true.
I wonder, Dr. Collier, if we can jump into a little of the detail of how this system works and the injustice of it, because I realize for some of us, we've been looking at this for a long time, but others, they may be totally new to the concept. So I want to hit 2 data points, and maybe I don't know what direction you want to go with this, but looking at the Ahmaud Arbery case, where you get these 3 guys, they jump in their trucks, they get their guns, and they're going to go after this guy. We saw him walk onto a job site, in this open construction of this house or whatever. That reminded me of the slave patrols. So in the South, the sort of policing system goes back to, during slavery, there were slave patrols where if you were a white person, you were responsible for making sure that none of the slaves ran away, and you had to kind of you had to go on patrol during certain times, and you'd be fined if you didn't. So this vigilantism, this idea that any white person within the community has a right to police the actions of any black person, is a historic pattern within the South. And then under Reconstruction, after emancipation, you get Reconstruction, and then Reconstruction ends when, through Rutherford B. Hayes, they pull the troops out of the South. Rise of the Ku Klux Klan, that vigilantism, the lynchings, thousands and thousands of black people lynched by mobs. So this is a cultural pattern within America. This isn't an isolated thing. And then I want to fast forward, and
It's what our law enforcement is built on. So
Exactly.
this is what our policing in American society is built on. It's built on policing the lives of specifically black people, but also persons of color in this country at different points of history, with this vigilantism. So specifically in the South, it gets worse, but we're really, we're no angels here in LA. So we definitely have our own situation, right? So Rodney King, 25, 30 years ago at this point, first one that was videotaped and broadcast nationally. So that same sense of vigilantism, that as a white person, you have the right to police the behavior of any person of color, but specifically black people in society. So you get to watch what we do. You get to tell oh my gosh, you're texting while you're driving. You shouldn't do that. Right? Yeah, and you must have done some other things. It's always kind of that hint of you must have done some other things, where black people are not able to just walk and breathe and be alive in society, and just no, I wasn't texting. Car keys are not on, or whatever the situation is, right? Or I just saw you text. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, that's I wanted to kind of gauge this. I'm thinking about with our incarceration rate right now, the mass incarceration, and it's skyrocketed since the 60s. I came across this quote by John Ehrlichman, who worked for Nixon. He's describing what they did deliberately So he said the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people, right? And he says, do you understand what I'm saying? We knew we could make it illegal to be either, we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt their communities, we could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So here's a presidential aide who's explaining the strategy that they used to be able to go into black communities, and especially they were concerned about the Black Panthers, but others, and just brutalize people willy-nilly because they saw them as a political threat, right? So when we talk about this stuff as being an intentional, systemic thing, nobody's making this up. This is actually what's being done, and Christians in particular have turned a blind eye to it for generations.
Yeah, it's still being done, I would say. So even when you're looking at the language and you're seeing when something's called like looters versus, an unruly college crowd.
Or thugs.
Yeah, well, yeah, but specifically, there is rioting and looting that happens after most baseball World Series and different sporting events.
All the time.
It happens all the time, and it happens on college campuses all the time. But then it's just called like an unruly group of exactly, or a celebration. But specifically when it's when the crowd is black or brown, or it's kind of being associated, because the other part is that when you're seeing these things happening and you actually see the footage of who is breaking into businesses, it wasn't the black people all of the time. If you didn't know that, that's a Cliff Note. But there it's the language that's being used to make it super criminalized in our eyes and in our sights. And just as you mentioned heroin, so heroin was criminalized then in the 60s. It's horrible, bad thing. Now it's because there's been an uptick in heroin usage now, but mostly amongst white Americans. And so now it's being treated as a medical issue.
Opioid crisis.
An opioid crisis that we need to treat rather than jail.
Right.
So it's very intentional. It's very insidious, actually. And so I think, what would be interesting for the audience to consider is that for some of us in the audience, this is new information. So this is wow, oh my gosh, I hadn't thought about it like that. And so now there's a whole reading list of things I need to get into, because you do. And for some of us, we've been watching this insidious behavior unfold generation upon generation upon generation. So I've been at my mother's knee, learning and seeing and watching this insidious behavior unfold. Yeah. So it's kind of realizing that, for some of us, you have some catching up to do.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'll just, in response to your question about the systemic, it was interesting in the movie that Johnny D's, one of his first things he said to Brian was, "You're guilty from the moment of being born." And he goes, "That's what it is down here. You don't know what it's like." And then there's another line that went by quick. I missed it in the movies theater. I saw it the second time, where they mentioned that 18-year-old black girl who was killed, she was killed. It was an 18-year-old crime, I think. It was never solved. So I was like, man, what a juxtaposition. This one crime, they're on top of it right away. Some young black girl gets killed. It's been 25 years. No one solved it, and no one even cares about it. So it does show a systemic problem. I think the movie did a really good job of not only talking about the systemic problem, it did a good job of actually demonstrating the systemic problems, just with the lawyer getting pulled over 2 or 3 times, just with people being followed around, just with the witnesses are being tampered with and no one seems to care. So it did a really good job of showing all of these are at systemic level issues that we can't do anything about it unless someone really gets in there and advocates fight, sort of like Brian did. So that's what I really appreciate about the movie. They just didn't talk about it, they actually demonstrated it.
I feel like what you're saying, one of the criticisms a lot of communities of color get is that it's well, why aren't you guys, where are your leaders? Why aren't you guys changing these things? And it's generations of people have been trying to change things, and it's not just our job to get everything in order before we're considered, human and capable of having compassion for us. Like, it's the job of the people who are upholding these systems to also dismantle it. Because, like, if we could have done it a long time ago, like, we would have, Yeah. And so I think that's just a challenge of, like, you have to look at what your piece is in it. And if it's, like, a new conversation to you, start small, and, like, work your way to the different systems that you're a part of. Because we're all a part of them in some shape or form.
Whitney, you make me think about the characters in the Bible, too, that the presumption of innocence, right? So Joseph was a convicted felon. He's a convicted rapist, falsely accused, right, in Egypt, and becomes prime minister of Egypt. Moses is a felon who did it. He's a murderer. God says, "You're my guy. You're my revolutionary to deliver my people." And Jesus pardons a woman who was guilty of what was at that time a capital crime. And so this idea that we look for something in a person who is other, a way to disqualify them for compassion or dignity, that's an important point. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the couple things that you said. One is that there is an interesting gender component that continues onto today, right? So Breonna Taylor was actually murdered or homicide. It was a straight up murder, but that happened in March. That happened in March. But who you hear about now is George Floyd. Both deserve to be lifted up. Both deserve to be fought for. Both names deserve to be mentioned at all times. So we even still have an interesting gender component that still occurs today. But that'll be a conversation for another time. But I also want to add to what you were saying about like there is like this sense of like, so why don't you go and do something about it? Like, that's what I've been doing since I was about 15, right? So we're working and we're doing. I think that one thing that we learn from history, right? So one thing that history has taught us is that when we do have a singular leader, that singular leader has been assassinated in the street, similar to George Floyd. So today, it's not going to be a singular leader because we don't want the movement to be stopped that easily. That's just too easy, right? So it's going to be grassroots, and it's going to be multi-layered and multi-leveled. It's going to be lots of people involved, which means there's room for you, too. Because many of the folks sitting in the courtroom, in the movie, were good Christian folk. I'm sure. So that begs the question of what's happening in your church. What conversation are you having in there? What is your church offering? What are you doing? What is your small group doing? There's room for all of us. It's so big that there's room for all of us, and it's going to take all of us to chop away at our little piece of it.
That's good.
It's good. Well, I mean,
I'm sorry.
Please.
One thing that for me that became an interpretive model or interpretive lens for society that we sort of forgot about. So you had the young man, I'm horrible on names, so forgive me. You had the young man who was gunned down by the guys in the truck, the young man jogging, and then you had George Floyd, but in the middle of that, we had the lady in Central Park. We forget about that, and to me, she became an interpretive lens that allowed America to realize, whoa, we have a systemic problem. Those other two people, it was like individual, we can blame, and this lady, she wasn't blaming him, she went African-American male. I'm going to use the system to my advantage, and at that point, I think a lot of people were able to now look at both of these and others and go, wait a minute. This is they've been saying this since 1619. They're telling the truth. So I think that we kind of forget about that, but I think that helped some people wrap their minds better around it. It became this an interpretive lens, so to speak, or heuristic device, if you want, Google that. So I think that also helped the the impetus for let's get out and march, because it helped frame something that we've been saying for forever. So I think we forget about that sometimes, and you're right, we're very selective, and we're gender selective too. That's another conversation.
There's so many threads to pull here. I do want to get a question from one of the viewers, and this question says this: I keep hearing just preach the gospel, as if the church shouldn't be talking about race. Can you explain why that's not helpful? Pastor Adam, you want to start with that?
So the idea of separating the preaching of the gospel from social action, that is not a biblical idea. That idea grew out of the split in the United States over the issue of slavery. As the nation was being birthed, in order to kind of compromise between non-slaveholding states and slaveholding states, they kind of kicked the can down the road, and well, we just won't deal with that issue. And eventually it comes to a head with the Civil War. But just the Baptists become a nice microcosm. So at one point they bring a case up in the Baptist Convention. Should we allow this guy who's a slaveholder to be a missionary? And they fight over that, and the Northerners say no, that slavery is evil, and the Southerners say no, it isn't, and they defend from the Bible slavery is okay, and they form the Southern Baptist Convention. So Southern Baptists were formed in order to continue slavery, right? So they're not going to preach against it. They're not going to preach about injustices and discrimination. They're going to talk about just converting people to Jesus, just convert them make a decision to follow Christ. And then you get the revivalist movement. You get people like George Whitfield, like Jonathan Edwards, slaveholders. So yeah, they're preaching, you need to turn to Jesus, but meanwhile, George Whitfield is running his orphanage with slave labor and petitioning Parliament to allow slavery throughout Georgia. You get Finney, who I think was one of the best in terms of how he treated black people, but he had integrated crusades, preaching and so forth, but he also kept people separate. He believed in segregation. So you have this constant complicity of the church in racism and injustice. So yes, we are going to limit how we preach the gospel because we don't want to be preaching against ourselves all the time. And so that's where we get this anemic, truncated heresy gospel that says all we do is convert people to Jesus. Jesus wasn't about that. Paul wasn't about that. And certainly the minor prophets weren't about that. If you read what the Bible actually says, you're going to end up with a robust gospel that is both about what you say and what you do. But if you just absorb what you're going to be taught here in the United States from generation to generation, you're going to get a heretical, truncated, anemic gospel that says live like hell and just convert people.
Wow. Can you just keep talking? I mean, I like the heresy idea. Wow. Wow. Anybody else want to respond to that?
And the other thing, too, part of it also is a theology that privileges the immaterial over the material. And part of that is out of this Platonic view of things. And what I mean by that is the only thing, how do we relate to God? We relate to God through our reason. That's it. And that's where God touches us most. And I'm thinking, well, I have a body. Jesus had a body. God relates to us in our embodied state. And my soul, if my soul goes there, my body's going there. And Jesus died on the cross, rose from the dead, came back in a body. And so that body is part of who we are because God created it. As we see in creation, he said it was good. So the problem is, though, there is a theological privileging of the immaterial over the material. And I don't want to take time to unpack that fully through the history, but that also becomes part of the preach the gospel is just save my soul. And like Adam said, preaching the gospel also includes save my soul and deliver my body from this injustices that's happening around here, which is now where ecclesiology kicks in. That's what our church community is supposed to do. That's what we're supposed to live we're supposed to live differently than the world system. So the church can now be a place of refuge where I can come in, I'm refreshed, and I know that people will take care of my soul and my body in this full completeness, if that makes sense.
I think it also, like, one of the biggest components is it kind of assumes that, like, God created us to be different for no reason. Like, it's just kind of like out of just, I'm going to make everybody look a little different, like you're coloring a coloring book. And I think it is really dishonoring to creation in general, that God put so much intentionality and time into each and every one of us. And, everybody loves to say like, oh, he knit me together in my mother's womb, but like, don't actually take the time to think that includes our skin color, and every part of that is intentional and valuable to the church and our experiences. And so I think like if we choose to ignore that, then we're missing a whole other side of how God chose to reveal himself to us.
Thank you.
I'll try to quickly say that. I think, kind of turn the question back a little bit, because it seems like there's this, it's kind of speaking to this fear that we have about what might slip into, our theology. So we're really trying to hold off Marxism and socialist ideology, and we don't want that to slip into our theology. And so, one of my good friends says, you have to look at what's already in there, friends. So if you are quoting and citing and living by theologians who were slaveholders, there's some stuff already mixed in there for you. It's a nice little cocktail that we don't really do well with, right? It hasn't done well for us here. So I think we're busy kind of running away from one thing that we're not heavily critiquing what we've already brought into it. And so like what Pastor Edgerly was saying earlier, it's looking at there is a reason why a slave-holding theologian would say, don't talk about race. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, here's another question, and maybe we'll start with you, Dr. Collier. How can we hold our criminal justice system accountable when the people who protect our communities abuse their power?
Yeah, so I would say that they are beholden to us. So there are small ways and there are large ways. Small ways, super small, super easy. You can do it right now today. Serve jury duty. Serve jury duty. I think that we try to, there's this thing about like trying to run away from it, and I don't want to do it. And we don't realize that when juries come back with things that we don't like, they were the people that showed up that day for jury duty. Okay, so care enough to do that. That's a very small way that you can get in right now. Other than that, we the people have the power to change many things. So there's a huge, and I feel like I'm going to start a firestorm with this. So there's been a huge call to defund the police here in the U.S., and that is actually starting to happen. And that happens because of the deep roots organizing that people in the Black Lives Matter movement have been doing for the last 7 years. So get involved. The system is not unchangeable. We can change it. You can change laws. You can change policies. You can vote people in or out. If you have prosecutors that have a history of not prosecuting law enforcement officers who brutalize people on the streets, and you don't agree with that, you can change the prosecutor by the way that you vote. So there's so many different ways and points of contact. The thing is, you have to actually get involved and get up and do something, not just on Facebook. I'm gonna stop. I'll let somebody else.
Dr. Collier, I think about, first of all, I'm just excited about this generation and the call to action. And I want to give a little theological, biblical underpinnings to what you're saying. The tendency when we talk about our relationship to law as Christians in America is to cite Romans 13, obey the governing authorities. And that's a great passage and it's a true passage, but it's a shallow understanding of our responsibility when it comes to government. So Isaiah 10, 1 through 2 here. Woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees to deprive the poor of their rights and withhold justice from the oppressed of my people, making widows their prey and robbing the fatherless. So God is going beyond obey the governing authorities, obey the existing laws. God is saying, what kind of laws do you have in the first place? And he actually holds us responsible to take action. Proverbs 24:11, rescue those being led away to death, hold back those staggering towards slaughter. If you say, but we knew nothing about this, Does not he who weighs the heart perceive it? Does not he who guards your life know it? And will he not repay everyone according to what they have done? And so God holds us, and especially in a democratic republic where we vote, we craft laws, we imagine the structure of our government, and we bring that imagination into reality. God holds us responsible for how the system works, how it is structured, not just who's in office, but how the whole thing is built. So we can't passively sit on the and say somebody ought to do something. God's going to say, what did you do?
All right, here's another question from our viewers. How do we not become discouraged or be cynical that actual change will occur within the systems of power? When you come to find out during the endnotes in the film that the sheriff involved in this case was not removed from his position, but was able to remain until his retirement in 2019. Yeah. How do you move forward? Where's the hope in the injustice? How do we find that hope?
I think for me, so I am a first-gen student, so I think during my time in college, I thought of a lot of ways in which I was the first person to do things. So during election season, I put a post about how I am only the second generation in my family to have been born with the right to vote as a woman and as a Black person. And so I think if you want to get, it's easy to become discouraged if you only want to see change within your lifetime. But I know that people who came before me fought so hard and didn't even see the fruits of their labor, but so that I could be here, and I can be at a university like Biola and vote and, pursue any dreams that I want to do. So I think you have to take your perspective out of I want these freedoms for myself, but also you have to look at generationally, what are you working towards?
I agree with her 100%. It reminds me of sort of Joseph when he told him, take my bones. I'm not going to make it. Make my bone. But he was thinking, like she said, generationally. And when I saw the sheriff, my initial response was, it was a little despair, but then I remembered the work that Brian's doing, and it gave me a call to action. So I took it instead of being despaired, I'm going to use this as a motivation for action. I'm going to use this as a motivation to get more involved. I'm going to use this as a motivation to see what Brian is doing. And of course, I can't be a lawyer, but there's other areas I can do something. So that's how I use that as a motivation not to get discouraged, but as a sense of urgency. And now it's a call for me to get off of Facebook and stop using hashtags and actually doing something.
Yeah, so I want to jump in there and say, it's similar to the answer to the previous question, because something else you can do is vote, because the sheriff is an elected official. So that particular sheriff remained sheriff because the people in that community continued to elect him. How many people were in that community that were thinking, oh man, there's just nothing I can do? You could vote for someone different. Because you don't like how he is sheriffing your area. So that I definitely wanted to make sure that I pointed that out, because we don't all know that the sheriff is an elected official and you can easily vote them in and vote them out. So that is a power that's within you. It's within the community. You can do some grassroots kind of organizing, talking about people, and hey, there's a person over here. Looks like I think that person would be a great next sheriff. Let's work on that person's campaign. Let's get them up and running. So I would say that. I think additionally is look at the actual wins that we have. There have been so many wins. I mean, just in this month, with defunding the police and bringing down their budget. And, I feel like I'm tossing that term around and people don't understand what that means. So in defunding the police, there is a spectrum of things from abolition, so completely abolishing law enforcement. There are people who want that, but all the way to reform, right? So and there's people live many different places in between there, right? So right now we're kind of having some of the reform area where a large portion of the budget has been decreased, because if we can decrease the budget there, perhaps we can put it into some other social service areas. So look at those wins. And there's been so many. It doesn't have to be this huge, win all of the time. Sometimes it's just like taking a class, right? We're speaking to students here. So it's just like taking a class. You have to pass the quiz that leads up to the midterm, that leads up to the final, right? So sometimes it's looking at the incremental things, and those small wins, and that will motivate you to keep you moving forward.
Can I speak briefly to the defund the police? So I know we are dealing with a very broad audience, and the defund the police slogan might raise red flags for some people, and it will play into the law and order narrative. Richard Nixon used that very effectively. Ronald Reagan used it effectively. Bill Clinton picked up on it, realized that as a Democrat he needed to be the law and order guy in order to get elected, and we're going into another election cycle, and sure enough, that's the narrative again. So as you hear the term defund the police, I think you did a great job, Dr. Collier, pointing out that slogan represents a spectrum of possible responses, and one of them, actually, police are very much in favor of. When a person, I serve on a panel called the Clergy Council with the Department of Mental Health in Los Angeles. And one of the things that's a problem is if somebody has a mental health issue and you call 911 because this person is staggering around, they're lost, they're having some type of a crisis and they need help. When you call 911, guess who shows up? The police show up because other people don't have budgets.
Yeah. And it's the 21-year-old who just came out of the academy. Right. So I think that one example, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you. So one example that I like to use is we just all lived through a quarantine, right? And still it's in a bit, coronavirus, right? So in that, what made you feel safe? When you first heard about the virus and when everything went on quarantine and our state was the first to shut down here in California, what made you feel safe? It probably wasn't calling 911 for a police officer to come to your door. It was probably toxicologists and doctors and nurses and people to pick up your groceries at the store and bring them to you if you were so privileged to be able to work at home, right? There were many different things that made you feel safe, right? So the call for defunding the police is saying that. Right now, the way that we have our system set up, we have everything reliant upon law enforcement. So every emergency that happens, we call 911 and a police officer comes out. They are not necessarily the best people to respond to certain things. So in the midst of the coronavirus, a police officer wasn't gonna do nothing for you. I mean, half the time they weren't even given proper PPE. So they couldn't help you, right? So defunding, bringing down the funding in one area. So not necessarily eliminating, although there are people who want to eliminate, but there are many people that are more on the reform side. So they're saying bring down how much money we're giving there so that we can pour more money into social services. So that when there's a homeless person who is being loud or something on a bus, that we have someone who can come out, sit with that person and say, hey, what's going on? Do you need a shower? Do you need a place to stay? Have you eaten? Is everything okay? Are you regulated? Is there a medical emergency happening with you? Let me get you to some services, rather than calling a law enforcement officer who they really are coming out. Their purpose and their function in society is to come out and say, is a law being broken, yes or no? That's it. Is a law being broken here? Yes? Great. Let me arrest you and take you in. That's not always the answer, right? So that's what the call is for. But thank you. I'm glad you did bring that up.
Yeah. And don't recognize when you're being played. So when you hear the law and order narrative, do your homework on that. That is a racist dog whistle going all the way back to Richard Nixon, designed to hype people up with fear and to get them to vote for the same status quo. We didn't always have this hyper-militarized police system, and you can go back historically, and crime rates were lower when we didn't have that kind of stuff going on. So we used to have mental health facilities where a person could be treated long-term. Reagan defunded all of that. So shifting funds into services that we need, taking them away from a budget here in the LA County that's 50% of the budget, that just kind of makes sense. So go beneath the surface. It's not saying you have to agree with everything, but do your own homework. Don't just listen to somebody's slogan and think, well, I'm always going to vote on this side of the equation, because you may find there's a lot of logic on the other side.
Well, I know, it's already 8 o'clock, and we've talked. It's been so fast, but I definitely want to give us some more space. So please stick with us for a little bit longer. I just want you guys to go around. We'll start with you, Dr. Harris, and just give us some closing statements. What are some things that you want to leave us with? Maybe something that you might want to challenge us to think through a little bit more.
That's a deep question. I think if I had to put it in the context and frame it of the movie Just Mercy, I think for me the one thing that I would want to leave is try to live that same spirit-filled life that Jesus led. He led a spirit-filled life of reaching out to the marginalized. He led a spirit-filled life of trying to relieve oppression, and then he turned around and poured that same spirit out on us. And that same spirit of liberation that he had, he gave to us. So he empowered us, the church, to do that. And you see it through the book of Acts. They shared their resources. And in our context, part of their shared resources would be proper criminal access to criminal justice, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the church, we should get back to that proper a way of viewing our spirit-filled life as one of sacrifice, giving up something of ourselves to the other at a cost to ourselves, and not necessarily we don't benefit. And you see that all the way through Just Mercy. You see that through Brian. You see that through Eva, the director. You see that through Johnny D's family. They lost their anonymity. You see that through Ralph. Ralph lost something in order to tell the truth. He definitely didn't know what his outcome. So in this whole Just Mercy was about people sacrificially giving up something to save the other at no benefit to themselves. And that is the life I think we should live. And to me, that is a demonstration of a spirit-filled, cruciform life, because Jesus led a life of sacrifice even to the point of death. And to me, that's the church has to get back to that. And to me, that's the gospel.
So good. Ms. Barnard?
I think for me, just the film, kind of like outside of just the narrative, is that the stories are important. And the stories that we choose to tell, the stories that we choose to listen to are important. And I think right now, we have a chance to decide, like, who are we going to listen to? And Just Mercy is one of so many amazing films that both educate and also offer us a chance to show compassion. And so I think for me, if anyone was to take anything away, is like, listen to people's stories. Oftentimes people are not going to lie to you when they tell you about, these experiences that they have. And so, yeah, stories are important, and listen to those around you who are trying to tell you them.
Thank you.
Well, I'm encouraged even just to hear you saying that, Whitney, because I think about this generation, and as people are making decisions in college about what will I do with my life, and to be a storyteller, to go into law like Brian Stevenson did. He was a student at a Christian school, and he had to decide what he was going to do with his life. He decides to go to Harvard Law. He decides he's going to use his life to fight for justice. And I see the streets filled with young people, not just here in the United States, but around the world, who are getting excited. But now what really makes me excited is to think students are going to decide what they're going to do with their lives. They're going to decide, how am I going to invest my life to make a difference for Christ? And maybe it isn't just about getting a comfortable job and a nice suburban home. Maybe there's a way that I can actually make an impact for Christ that will change the world. That gets me very excited. So I'm actually very hopeful with what I see going on right now, and the enthusiasm and how God is using this moment to call people into a life of service that's going to make a difference. And I also see where people who are not Christ followers, come from different traditions, may even be anti-Christian, when they see things like Just Mercy and they realize this is, people say they're doing this because they follow Jesus. Well, then who is this Jesus that they follow?
Yeah.
And I'm seeing people turn to Jesus because they see that this is what Jesus is all about.
Yeah, I would say I hope that the movie sparked like an interest that you chase after. There's so many different books and articles and podcasts, and there's so many different lists that are kind of going around social media today that you can like kind of tag on to, like, so here's a list of this and here's a list of that and here's like, there's so many different lists out there, and I'm sure that we have some here, resources here as well. So I hope that it just sparks you on a journey to just get out there and learn as much as you can, listen as much as you can, to kind of get just fully immersed and involved, to then do something, right? So don't be, we were talking earlier about Jesus being crucified. Don't be a part of the crowd that was yelling, crucify him. Don't find yourself there. Don't find yourself there. Don't find yourself amongst the ones who weren't maybe yelling as loud as others and maybe was a little more quiet and they just were standing around while everybody else was yelling, crucify him. You are just as guilty. Don't find yourself there. But instead find yourself on the right side.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm so grateful for your guys' voices. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom in the last hour plus. So I just learned a lot from you guys, and I hope our viewers learned a lot from you guys. Thanks for sticking with us. We're so grateful, and we just want to encourage you guys to keep learning, keep growing, and hope you guys have a good night, and blessings to you guys as you finish out tonight.